Hey Rupert,
Hi,
thank you very much for sitting down and talking to us about your new album.
Thank you.
I hear a big birthday is coming up.
Yeah, I'm going to be 40 in December.
Oy. Nice one, huh?
Yeah,
Time to look back?
yeah, well, in a way, yes, because that's sort of what I was doing with this album, is looking back a little bit, because this album will also be, at the same time, the 10th anniversary of me releasing a solo project.
So the new album is related to this birthday?
Yes, definitely. I wanted to do something to mark my 40th birthday and the 10th anniversary, and in the end the idea of doing a 40-track album just seemed like the most logical and obvious way of doing it. I'm not quite sure why it took me 3 months to figure out that as the concept behind it, but in the end it was the one that made the most amount of sense. And I already had about 10 tracks already in existence that were created for the online Disquiet Junto weekly music challenge, which Mark Weidenbaum runs, that I wanted to include in the album. So that sort of dictated where I was going to go with the album, or the template for the sound of the album already, and then it was a question of finding the other 30 tracks or whatever.
Well, you practically answered my next question. I was going to ask you about the concept of this new album.
Well, I mean, it was a loose concept in some ways, because it was just 40 tracks, and my only real concern when doing the album was I didn't want it to be... I wanted to have some variety in the 40 tracks. I didn't want it... it's an hour and 35 minutes, I think. 135 minutes is the total running time of the album. That's a lot of tracks. I've never done an album as long as that, not even a soundtrack that's been that long. So there was a question of how do you keep it interesting? How do you provide enough variety throughout the album to really make it interesting for the listener? And as I said, I had 10 tracks that already existed. Some of them were electronic, some of them were guitar based. So that then dictated whatever else I did. Some of those tracks had to have guitar on them, and some of the guitar based tracks that I already had to have electronics added to them. And so in a sense, that sort of dictated the concept of the album more than a fixed concept. And then at some point the title popped into my head, which is a steal from Borges. I had a collection of short stories by Borges called Fictions, and I just liked the idea of like a short story concept, that each track would be like its own little mini soundtrack. A bit like the sort of compilations where you get, of a composer's work, and you get like maybe a suite from a particular film, and then in the sleeve notes there'd be a little blurb about what the film was about, and that's all you had from that film. It's this 5-minute piece or whatever to give you the whole tone and mood of what the film was trying to do, and I like that idea, and so that was sort of in the back of my mind as well.
What is the biggest difference of this album compared to your previous albums?
Well, one major difference in the most recent sets of albums that I've been doing, the most recent albums in the last few years, or the last 3 or 4 releases I've done, have been almost entirely made with hardware, and specifically a modular synthesizer. And for this album I kept the modular synthesizer, but I obviously, for the sake of variety, I added to the palette of sounds. So we had several hardware synthesizers, which was a new thing for me. 10 years ago when I did my first sort of solo release, I was moving away from hardware to purely software, and now with this album I've gone back the other way over the last couple of years. I've been moving back towards incorporating more hardware, And this one, at the end of 2015, I suddenly found I had 3 new hardware keyboard synthesizers, and I wanted to incorporate them into the sound palette for this album. And they all happened to be by the same company, which was ironic. They all happened to be by Roland. That wasn't intentional. I bought one, a new one, the Roland System 1, because I wanted a keyboard-based synthesizer to complement the modular. And then at the end of last year, I happened to get hold of 2 second-hand Roland synthesizers, the Juno 106 and the D50. And then during the process of the album, I also bought a Roland Boutique JX03, which is a recreation of another 80s synthesizer, actually the successor of the Juno 106, the JX3P. So I had these keyboard synthesizers, all from the same company, with a slightly similar sound, even though they're very different in style. And they've got a very 80s sound. And I sort of embraced that. That was a lot of my work in the last 10 years has had a sort of retro 80s vibe anyway. And the synthesizer just pushed it in that direction. And the nice thing was, because I had pre-existing tracks, by using this very small palette of 4 or 5 synthesizers, and then the modular and some guitars, then I was able to take pieces that already existed, stuff that I'd worked on, creating demos for products and stuff like that, and then overdub using these 4 or 5 devices, and the whole thing sort of started to sound like it was all meant to be one collected piece of work because of the sounds. So that's really what's different about it, is branching away from just modular back towards hardware keyboard synthesizers, and specifically Roland was.
So it's no surprise that I perceive an 80s retro soundtrack feel.
Absolutely. No, that was there from the get-go, and some of the pieces I'd done for the Disquiet Challenge had that vibe, and then I had a couple of other pieces as well, and so it was going in that direction, and I just thought, well, if it's going in that direction, I'm going to embrace it. And then obviously the synthesizer, the sounds of the synthesizers themselves just enhanced that. But the 80s is what I grew up with, and the music, and particularly the soundtracks to movies from that decade, still mean a lot to me. It's possibly a construct. It's not necessarily what they actually were. It's my version in my head of what they were. But there's definitely a sense of nostalgia and something that I really like about those movies. Also because I think the soundtracks back then were the technology wasn't that you could imitate an orchestra or acoustic instruments with electronics. So when you did an electronic soundtrack back then, you were hired to be electronic. You weren't hired to imitate something else for a budget. So people were more inclined to take risks, and something about those soundtracks, that period of electronic soundtracks, which means a great deal to me, and that I try to capture in this album.
Any particular examples from the period? Some guilty pleasure.
Some guilty pleasures, yeah. I didn't listen to anything specifically. I didn't go out of my way to listen to specific soundtracks to get inspiration.
Can I mention something?
Yeah.
Cat People.
Cat People, yeah. Cat People would definitely be one of them. The irony is that while I was making the album, I listened to the soundtrack, and it's one of those soundtracks which, for me, works better in the movie than when you listen to it as music in its own right.
Oh, I beg to differ.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of great tracks on it.
I love the film, but I love the soundtrack as a standalone.
Okay, well, I love Moroder. I love his work, and I love his soundtrack work, and I'm very fond of that particular film. But it's a funny thing. Maybe I need to listen to it again. It was the first time that I'd really heard the soundtrack in isolation, away from the movie, because I love it in the movie. I think it's spectacular in the movie. I think it's actually Moroder's best work.
Possibly, yes. I
I tell you what I did listen to, which I which I missed because I didn't grow up being a Madonna fan. I grew up being a Prince fan. Thomas Newman's score, which was one of his very, very early scores to Desperately Seeking Susan, was something I found it on YouTube, and I put it on the iPod, and I was listening to it a lot. And there's something about the way he tried to mimic the sort of production of Madonna's songs at the time in the soundtrack, and that particular sound, and using sequences and arpeggiators, and it was the beginning of the whole. The composer can sit at home and sequence it in a room without having to get other musicians in to play, and that sort of very metronomic drum programming and stuff. I tell you, another soundtrack that I love, that I rediscovered a couple of years ago, and my kids love, is Wang Chung's To Live and Die in LA. And what's interesting about that is they did the songs, in fact one song was pre-existing, and then they did all the underscore. So you've got a complete marriage of songs and underscore and scoring to picture, and it's all done by the same people, and it's all sort of in the same style. The only difference is some has vocals and some don't, and I love that soundtrack. The Manhunter soundtrack, even though it's done by lots of different people, sounds very cohesive. Even though it's got about 3 or 4 different people doing the soundtrack. That's another one. Michael Mann's films in general in the 80s. I mean, Tangerine Dream did a couple of his stuff, and they were very influential to me. Maybe not so much on this album, but certainly on other stuff that I've done. And then as I was compiling the album, or doing the last few overdubs, the Stranger Things TV series soundtrack came out, which is very 80s, and uses a lot of similar sounds, and has a similar vibe to the album. And that just encouraged me that, I'm going in the right direction, I'm going to embrace this. It's going to be very 80s, it's going to be very retro, and I'm cool with that. There's been a lot of 80s retro stuff that I've done, but this is really taking that to a new level.